They threw her out to die. One moment, she was inside, surrounded by the familiar faces of her settlement. The next, a rough hand shoved her from behind, and she was falling, landing hard in the biting snow. The heavy wooden door slammed shut, the sound like a judge's gavel. Final. The wind cut at her instantly. It wasn't just cold, it felt alive, a thinking thing made of ice and fury, slicing through the tattered rags they'd left her with. Her name was Elena, and she was a widow. Her husband had died in what they called a hunting accident, and with him gone, she was a burden, a curse. That's what the village elder had shrieked, his finger pointing at her, his face twisted with fear and hatred. They said misfortune followed her. That death clung to her like a second skin. So they cast her out. No food, no shelter, no mercy. Just the endless, unforgiving white of the winter wilderness. Elena forced herself to her feet, her legs sinking into the deep snow. Every step was agony, a promise of the slow, freezing death that awaited her. Her golden hair, once her pride, was now a tangled, frozen mess. Her eyes, hollowed out by grief and now terror, scanned the horizon. Nothing. Only the skeletal shapes of trees and the swirling dance of snowflakes, like tiny ghosts, come to escort her to the afterlife. In the distance, a sound drifted through the trees. A howl, a wolf. Then another, and another, joining in a hungry chorus. They smelled her. They were close. She fell to her knees, the last of her strength gone. The cold wasn't just on her skin anymore. It was inside her, seeping into her bones, turning her blood to slush. The world blurred, the white snow and the gray sky melting into a single blinding abyss. This was it. This was the end. But as her vision faded to black, a shadow fell over her. A figure, impossibly large, cloaked in thick animal furs. A man knelt beside her, his face hard and weathered, his dark eyes fierce and unyielding. She felt his hands on her skin, and they were strong, and they were warm. "You're not going to die," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to push back against the wind. "Not tonight." Then, with a power that seemed almost inhuman, he lifted her from the snow. He cradled her in his arms, her head resting against the solid wall of his chest. He moved through the storm not like a man fighting it, but like a man who was part of it. Each step was certain, each breath a cloud of hot steam in the freezing air. He smelled of wood smoke and cedar and something wild, something she couldn't name. It was the scent of life. Elena's mind was a swirling fog of pain and confusion, drifting between the darkness and the biting reality of the wind. She clung to his fur cloak, her fingers numb and trembling. In the distance, through the blizzard, she saw a flicker of light, a tiny spark of orange against the oppressive white. A campfire. A promise. The man held her tighter, his jaw clenched against the cold. "Stay awake," he commanded, his voice a lifeline. "Stay with me." Her eyelids felt like stones. As they fluttered shut, the last thing she saw was his face. The face of a stranger, the face of the man who was refusing to let her die. But as she surrendered to the darkness, a single, terrifying thought echoed in her mind. Why? The first thing she felt was warmth, a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to be coaxing her back to life, chasing the deathly chill from her bones. The scent of burning cedar filled the air, and she heard the gentle crackle of a fire. Elena's eyes fluttered open. She was in a small, sturdy shelter made of branches and furs, a flickering fire pushing back the shadows. Across from her sat the man who had saved her. He was sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes, his dark eyes focused on the gleam of the steel. The firelight danced across his face, revealing high cheekbones and a jawline that looked like it was carved from granite. He was a man of the wilderness, and he looked just as dangerous as the storm outside. Elena tried to speak, but her throat was a raw, aching knot. The man looked up, and his gaze was piercing. It didn't feel cruel, but it felt knowing, like he could see right through her. "Drink," he said, his voice the same low rumble she remembered. He held out a wooden bowl filled with steaming broth. Her hands trembled as she took it, the heat a welcome shock. She sipped the hot liquid. It burned her throat, but in a good way, like it was scorching the frost from her insides. After a moment, she found her voice. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did you save me?" The man's jaw tightened. He didn't look at her, staring instead into the dancing flames. "Because they left you to die," he said, his voice heavy, "and no one should die alone in the snow." A silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackling fire and the howl of the wind outside. It was a simple answer, but it felt incomplete. There was something else there, something he wasn't saying. "What's your name?" Elena asked, her voice a little stronger now. His eyes flicked toward the fire. "Takakota," he said. He paused. "Cheyenne." "Elena?" she replied, the name feeling strange on her own tongue. They said I was cursed." Takakota's gaze hardened. A muscle in his clenched jaw jumped. "People fear what they don't understand," he said, his eyes still locked on the flames. "But out here in this wild, fear can kill you faster than the cold." Elena swallowed, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. He was right. She was alive because of this stranger, this man named Takakota. In a world that had thrown her away, he was her only hope. But as she looked at his hard face and the deadly knife in his hands, she realized something else. He could just as easily be her end. Elena watched him from the shelter. Takakota moved through the snow with a silence that was unnerving. His fur-lined boots left barely a trace. He was a ghost in the white landscape, a man who belonged to this harsh, unforgiving world. The fire crackled, a fragile shield against the endless cold. Takakota returned with an armful of firewood, his breath misting in the air. The storm was getting worse, the wind shrieking like a tormented spirit. "The storm worsens," he said, his voice a low rumble as he fed another log to the flames. "We can't stay here long." Elena's heart, which had just begun to thaw, froze again. "Where will we go?" she asked, the words laced with a desperation she couldn't hide. Takakota knelt by the fire, his broad shoulders blocking its light. "My people have a camp, a day's walk north." He paused, and the hesitation was heavy. "But they will not welcome you." Elena's throat tightened. "Because I'm a settler." It wasn't a question. Takakota's dark eyes finally met hers, and the firelight reflected in their depths, like tiny embers. "Because they have been betrayed before," he said, his voice flat and hard. "Other settlers came. They spoke of friendship, of peace." He looked away, his gaze distant and haunted. "Their promises are buried under the snow now, along with many of my people." The words hung in the air between them, colder than the wind, sharper than his knife. A truth that cut deep. Elena looked down at her hands, digging her fingers into the fur blanket she sat on. "I'm not like them," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I had nothing to do with what they did. My own people cast me out." Takakota's jaw clenched, his expression unreadable, carved from stone. "It doesn't matter," he said. "To them, your face is the same as theirs. Your words are the same. To them, you are just another settler." The silence in the shelter grew thick and suffocating. Outside, the wind screamed. "You could leave me here," Elena said, her voice hollow. "It was a test. It would be easier for you." Takakota's eyes narrowed, his gaze locking onto hers with a sudden, fierce intensity. His hands, resting on his knees, tightened into fists. "I do not abandon people to the storm," he said, his voice a rough, low whisper that carried an unmistakable weight of conviction. He leaned forward slightly, the firelight casting his face in harsh angles. Not even those who do not belong. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. He wasn't going to leave her. He was a man bound by a code she couldn't comprehend, an honor that defied the brutal logic of this land. He was going to take her, a settler, an outsider, into the heart of a people who had every reason to hate her. She was a stranger in this land. She had no people, no place, no future, except for the one this silent, dangerous man was forging for her with every stubborn breath. As he turned back to the fire, she knew with chilling certainty that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one she was walking into. The journey was a frozen hell. The wind was a constant, physical assault, carrying whispers of death and despair. Takakota led the way, a dark, powerful shape moving relentlessly through the snow-laden forest. He didn't seem to feel the cold. He didn't seem to tire. He was a force of nature. Elena, however, felt everything. Each step was a battle. Her breath came in sharp, painful gasps, each one searing her lungs. Her legs, weak from hunger and cold, trembled with every step. "Keep moving," Takakota said over his shoulder, his voice firm, not unkind, but without a trace of pity. "If you stop, the cold will take you. It is that simple." Elena bit down on her chapped lip, the small sting of pain a welcome distraction. She focused on the back of his fur-lined cloak, on the steady rhythm of his stride. The world around her was a desolate sea of white and gray. The trees were skeletal, their branches groaning under the weight of the snow like old bones. "How much farther?" she asked, her voice a ragged, desperate whisper. Takakota glanced back, his jaw set, his eyes scanning the oppressive forest. "A few hours, maybe more. The storm slows us." Elena swallowed, her throat raw and parched. The fear she'd felt in the wilderness was changing. Before, she feared the cold, the wolves. Now, she feared the people they were walking toward. If they rejected her, where would she go? The thought was a black hole in her mind. Suddenly, a sound shattered the frozen silence, a sharp, violent crack that echoed through the trees. A gunshot. Instantly, Takakota froze. He was no longer a man walking. He was a predator that had scented danger. His eyes narrowed, scanning every shadow, every tree. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous command. His hand went to the knife strapped to his thigh. Elena's heart exploded in her chest, hammering against her ribs. Her breath caught, fogging in the icy air. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Takakota's jaw was a line of granite. "Hunters," he said, his eyes dark. He paused. "Or worse." Without another word, he grabbed her wrist. His grip was like iron. He pulled her off the path they were making, deeper into the thickest part of the forest. Branches whipped at her face, snapping under their feet. The wind seemed to mock them, its howl a haunting lullaby. Then the gunshot echoed again, closer this time, much closer. Elena's pulse was a roaring in her ears. A primal, gut-wrenching fear prickled down her spine. These were not her people. These were not Takakota's people. This was something else. "If they find us," Takakota said, his voice low and intense, his eyes burning with a cold fire she hadn't seen before. "You say nothing, you do nothing. You let me handle it." He didn't have to say what it was. She could see it in his eyes. Elena nodded, her throat too tight with terror to speak. As they pushed on, the snow falling heavier now, a thick, blinding curtain, she couldn't shake the terrifying feeling that followed them. It wasn't the feeling of being lost. It was the feeling of being hunted. The snow was a white wall, thick and blinding. Takakota didn't slow down. He tightened his grip on Elena's wrist, pulling her along, his body a shield against the worst of the wind. Every snap of a twig, every groan of a snow-heavy branch sounded like an enemy closing in. The gunshots were gone, replaced by a silence that was somehow more terrifying. The danger was no longer a distant sound. It was a presence, lurking just beyond the veil of the falling snow. Takakota's jaw was set, his eyes darting, scanning the trees with a predatory focus that made the hairs on Elena's neck stand up. "They're close," he muttered, his voice a low growl that was barely audible over the wind. Too close. Elena's heart was a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. "Who are they?" she managed to ask, her voice trembling so hard the words were barely recognizable. Takakota's gaze darkened, his jaw clenching so tight she could see the muscles bunch. "Raiders," he said, and the word was filled with a grim finality. "Men with no tribe, no honor. They roam these woods, they take what they want, and they leave nothing but blood and snow behind." A shiver of pure ice raced down Elena's spine. This was worse than wolves, worse than the cold. "They'll kill us," she whispered, the words stolen by the wind. Takakota's grip on her wrist tightened, a silent promise of protection. His face was a mask of stone. "Not if I kill them first." He didn't say it like a boast, he said it like a fact. They pressed on, the crunch of their boots the only sound in their immediate world. Elena's legs ached with a fire that defied the cold. Her skin was raw. The memory of the warm shelter, the life-giving broth, felt like a dream from another lifetime. Suddenly, Takakota halted. He didn't just stop. His entire body went rigid, like a wolf scenting its prey. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She followed his gaze. Ahead, through the swirling curtain of snow, dark shapes were moving. Figures. Not one, but three. They were draped in heavy, ragged furs, and rifles were slung over their shoulders. Their eyes, even from a distance, looked sharp and searching. They were looking for them. "Stay behind me," Takakota whispered. He released her wrist and in one fluid motion drew the long, gleaming knife from his hip. The blade seemed to drink the pale, gray light, looking deadly and cold. The men drew closer. Their faces were hard, bearded, and cruel. Their eyes gleamed like hungry wolves. They hadn't seen them yet, but they were on their trail. Then one of them looked up, and his eyes locked onto theirs. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face, revealing yellowed teeth. "Well, well," the man sneered, his voice cutting through the wind. His gaze raked over Elena, hungry and cruel. "What do we have here? A stray lamb and her pet dog?" Takakota didn't answer. He simply took a step forward, placing himself squarely between Elena and the raiders. He raised his knife slightly, the tip aimed at the leader's throat. His muscles were coiled, a predator ready to strike. "Leave," Takakota said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was a low, deadly growl that vibrated with contained violence. The men chuckled, their breath fogging in the frigid air. The leader raised his rifle, aiming it casually at Takakota's chest. "Or what?" he taunted. "You and your woman gonna stop us?" Takakota's eyes, which had been cold and hard, suddenly blazed. They were like embers fanned by the wind, burning with a pure, savage fire. "Or I will teach you what it means to die screaming in the snow." The air didn't just shatter, it exploded. Before the raider could even tighten his finger on the trigger, Takakota moved. He wasn't just fast, he was a blur, a storm of motion that erupted from perfect stillness. He closed the distance in 2 powerful strides, his knife flashing in the pale, icy light. The leader gave a choked cry of surprise, but it was too late. The blade of Takakota's knife sliced across the man's forearm. It wasn't a killing blow. It was a message. Crimson blood sprayed onto the pure white snow, a shocking splash of violence. The man howled in pain and rage, dropping his rifle as he clutched his bleeding arm. His 2 companions, startled out of their arrogant smirks, scrambled to raise their own weapons. Elena stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. Her heart was a wild bird trapped in her ribs, beating against them until she thought they would break. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it was paralyzing. Takakota moved like a force of nature, swift, brutal, relentless. He ignored the wounded leader and spun toward the second man, who was fumbling with his rifle. Takakota didn't use his knife. He drove his fist into the man's jaw with a sickening crack that echoed through the silent trees like another gunshot. The man's head snapped back, and he collapsed into the snow, unconscious before he even hit the ground. The third raider finally managed to raise his rifle, aiming it at Takakota's back. But Takakota was already moving. He pivoted on the ball of his foot, swinging his knife in a vicious, horizontal arc. The blade buried itself in the man's shoulder, sinking deep into muscle and bone. The rifle clattered to the ground. The man shrieked, a high, thin sound of pure agony, clutching the hilt of the knife now embedded in his body. "Run, Elena!" Takakota roared, his voice a thunderclap that broke through the storm and her paralysis. But her legs were frozen. Fear had rooted her to the spot. Her breath came in ragged, misty clouds, her mind unable to process the sheer speed and brutality of what she was witnessing. The wounded leader, his eyes wild and bloodshot, staggered to his feet. His face was a twisted mask of fury. He ignored the blood streaming from his arm and drew a long, jagged knife of his own. "You think you're tough, savage?" he snarled, his voice thick with hate. "Let's see how tough you are when I'm cutting out your girl's throat." He didn't lunge for Takakota. He lunged for Elena. Time seemed to slow down. The world narrowed to the silver arc of that jagged blade and the vicious snarl on the raider's face. This was it. This was her death. A blade in the snow, just as she'd always feared. But before the knife could reach her, Takakota was there. He moved with the force of a charging bear, his body colliding with the raiders in a brutal explosion of momentum. They tumbled to the ground together, a whirlwind of flying fists and kicking feet, snow spraying up around them in a blinding cloud. Elena watched in horror, finally shaken from her stupor. Takakota and the raider were a thrashing blur of violence. The other two men were gone. The one with the knife in his shoulder had stumbled away into the woods, screaming. The other was still unconscious in the snow. The leader's knife flashed, slashing through the air, and it caught Takakota across the cheek. A line of red appeared on his stoic face, but Takakota didn't even flinch. His eyes burned with a savage, untamed fire. With a roar that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth, Takakota drove his fist into the leader's jaw. The impact was horrifying, a sickening crunch of bone that cut through the howl of the wind. The raider's body went limp. His eyes rolled back in his head. And he collapsed, face down in the snow, a pool of blood already beginning to form beneath his head. Takakota rose to his feet, his chest heaving, his fists still clenched. Blood dripped from the cut on his cheek. Blood dripped from his knuckles, staining the snow at his feet like crimson tears. He stood over the fallen man, a silent, terrifying victor in a battle that had lasted less than a minute. And in the sudden, ringing silence, Elena finally understood. Takakota hadn't just saved her from the cold. He had saved her from men who were far, far worse. Takakota stood over the unconscious man, his breath coming in deep, controlled gusts, his chest rising and falling like a bellows. The blood from the cut on his cheek mingled with the falling snow, a stark contrast of life and the pale emptiness of the landscape. The snow fell heavier, a thick, relentless curtain, as if trying to bury the evidence of the brutal violence, to cover the crimson stains on the white ground. Elena's breath was shallow, each gasp a painful reminder that she was still alive. She stared at the fallen raider, at his bruised and broken jaw, his eyes closed in a stillness that could have been death. The wind howled, a long, mournful cry that seemed to echo the silent screams that still hung in the air. Takakota finally moved. He wiped the blood from his cheek with the back of his gloved hand, smearing it. His dark eyes, still burning with the embers of the fight, met Elena's. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough and low, yet laced with a genuine concern that cut through the violence of the moment. Elena shook her head, a small, jerky motion. Her knees were trembling so violently she was surprised she was still standing. I'm fine," she whispered, her gaze still fixed on the man lying motionless in the snow. You didn't have to—" "Yes," Takakota interrupted, his voice firm, his jaw clenching tight. "I did. Men like that," he gestured with his chin towards the fallen raider. "They do not stop. They do not reason. You do not stop them, they take everything. Until you are left with nothing." Elena swallowed, her throat tight with a mixture of fear and a strange, burgeoning gratitude. "But you could have been killed." Takakota's eyes darkened, his fists, still clenched at his sides, looked like rocks. "I have survived worse," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, a simple statement of fact that hinted at a past far more brutal than she could imagine. The silence stretched between them again, heavy and suffocating. The wind roared, whipping through the skeletal trees like a banshee's wail. "What do we do now?" Elena asked, her voice small and fragile in the vast, hostile wilderness. Takakota glanced down at the unconscious man, and his expression hardened into something cold and unforgiving. "We leave him," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "If he wakes, he will crawl back to his kind. If he does not—" He let the words hang in the air, the meaning as sharp and clear as a shard of ice. There was no mercy in this world for predators. Elena shivered, a chill that had nothing to do with the cold sinking deep into her bones. This was the law of this land, a law of survival, a law Takakota understood perfectly. "Where will we go?" she asked again, her hope a tiny flickering flame. Takakota's gaze flicked to the north, where the trees grew thicker and the wind seemed to sing a more ancient, ghostly song. "My people are close," he said. "But we must keep moving. This blood will draw wolves. And worse." He looked back at her, his expression unreadable. They do not trust outsiders. A knot of fear tightened in Elena's stomach. After all this, after surviving the cold, the raiders, she now faced a new, uncertain threat. "And me?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Will they trust me?" Takakota's jaw tensed, his eyes narrowing as he held her gaze. "That depends," he said, his tone impossible to decipher. "It depends on whether you can prove you are not like the men who came before you." Elena's heart clenched, the weight of his words pressing down on her like the tons of snow on the mountains around them. This was not the end of her trial. It was just the beginning. Without another word, Takakota turned and started walking north again. And as Elena hurried to follow, leaving the scene of brutal, bloody violence behind them, she couldn't shake the terrifying feeling that she was walking out of one kind of danger and straight into another, one that might be far more dangerous than a knife in the dark. The forest changed. The trees loomed taller, their branches heavy with snow, creating a dense canopy that blocked out what little light the gray sky offered. The air grew thick with the scent of pine and something else. Smoke. The smell of a settlement. Takakota moved ahead, his strides still powerful and sure, but now there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. He was approaching his home. And he was bringing a stranger with him. Elena's legs were screaming in protest, her breath coming in sharp, icy bursts. But the fear of being left behind was a greater pain. "How much farther?" she asked, her voice strained and weak. Takakota didn't answer. Instead, he raised a hand, a sharp, silent command for her to stop. Elena froze, her heart instantly pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She listened, straining her ears against the wind, and then she heard it. Not a single voice, but a low murmur. The sound of people drifting through the trees. Takakota's jaw clenched. "Stay close," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Do not speak, unless I speak to you." They moved forward, slowly now, until the trees parted. Before them lay a small, hidden clearing. Tents made of weathered animal skins were scattered around a large, roaring bonfire. But this was not a thriving village. Men, women, and children huddled together, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow with a deep, settled despair. Their clothes were worn, their expressions guarded and suspicious. This was a camp of survivors, of outcasts, of exiles. The sight of their suffering sent a chill down Elena's spine that was colder than any winter wind. They had been seen. A man detached himself from the group around the fire and stepped forward to meet them. His face was a road map of old battles, a thick scar running from his temple to his jaw, puckering the skin. One of his eyes was a milky, clouded white. His good eye burned with a fierce, intelligent light. He looked Takakota up and down, his gaze lingering on Elena with open hostility. "You bring a settler here, Takakota," the man said. It was not a question. It was an accusation. His voice was a low, dangerous snarl. "After everything they did to us." Takakota's jaw tightened, but his voice was steady, calm. "She was left to die in the snow, Chaska. Cast out by her own, she is not one of them." The man, Chaska, sneered, emotion that twisted his scarred face into a terrifying mask. His gaze flicked to Elena, and his one good eye burned with a rage so raw it felt like a physical blow. "They took my son," he spat, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "They burned our homes, drove us from our lands, and now you bring one of their kind into our last refuge." Elena swallowed against the lump of terror in her throat. She had to speak. She couldn't let them think she was an enemy. I didn't do those things," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I lost my husband. My own people cast me out. I have nothing." Chaska's good eye narrowed, his lips curling with contempt. "Nothing," he echoed, his voice dripping with venom. "You have your life. That is more than many of us can say, more than my boy can say." Takakota took a half step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Elena. His body was tense, a silent warning. "Enough, Chaska," he said, his voice low but carrying an authority that made several of the onlookers shift uncomfortably. "She is under my protection." Chaska let out a short, harsh laugh. "Your protection?" he sneered, his blazing eye sweeping over the crowd. "Your protection won't mean much when the others learn you've brought a snake into our den. Her curse will fall on us all." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Voices of agreement, of fear, of suspicion. They were a sea of hostile faces, their own suffering making them deaf to hers. Elena's heart pounded. She looked from the hateful face of Chaska to the stoic, unreadable expression of Takakota. He had brought her here, saved her life, but he was just one man against the fear and hatred of an entire tribe. In that moment, she knew. Her fight for survival hadn't ended. It had just found its real battlefield. The campfire crackled and spat, its flames licking at the cold night air. The shadows it cast danced across the hard, unforgiving faces of the tribe. Dozens of eyes were fixed on Elena, and they were not friendly. They were eyes filled with suspicion, with grief, with a hatred that had been earned in blood. Takakota stood beside her, his arms crossed over his massive chest, a silent mountain of defiance. His jaw was set like stone. Chaska, the man with the scarred face and one good eye, paced before them like a caged wolf. His every movement radiated menace. "You say she is innocent," he boomed, his voice loud enough to carry to every corner of the tense clearing. "But why should we believe you, Takakota? You have been gone for many days. How do we know she is not a spy, a settler sent to find our last hiding place and lead the others back to finish the job?" A low growl of agreement rumbled through the crowd. Their anger, their pain, was a living thing, simmering just beneath the surface, looking for a place to lash out. Elena swallowed hard, her pulse a frantic pounding in her ears. This was a trial, and she was already judged guilty. Takakota's eyes never left Chaska's face. His gaze was fierce and unyielding. "She was left to die," he repeated, his voice firm and unwavering, cutting through the murmurs. "Cast out by her own people. I fought off raiders to protect her. She is not a threat." Chaska snorted, a sound of pure derision. His one good eye gleamed with a cruel disdain. "Or perhaps she is just skilled at playing the victim," he shot back, taking a step closer to Elena, invading her space. "We have all lost something because of her kind. I lost my son. We lost our land. We lost our dignity. And now you ask us to what? Trust one of them?" Elena trembled under Chaska's burning glare, but she would not collapse. She clenched her hands into tight fists at her sides, her fingernails digging into her palms. "I am not here to hurt anyone," she said, her voice shaking but gaining strength with each word. "I don't want anything from you, only a chance to survive the winter." Chaska's lips curled into a cruel, thin smile. It did not reach his eye. "Then prove it," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush, yet carrying deadly weight. "If you wish to stay among us, to share our fire and our food, you must pass the trial." The crowd murmured louder now, a wave of nods and tense agreement. This was something they understood, a trial, a test of spirit. Takakota's jaw clenched, his fists tightening until his knuckles were white. "Chaska," he began, his voice a low, dangerous warning. "This is foolishness." "Enough!" Chaska roared, cutting him off. He ignored Takakota, his gaze locked onto Elena, pinning her in place. "Tomorrow at first light," he announced, his voice booming with authority. "You will walk alone into the frozen woods. You will go to the place we call the Black Cliff." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Even in her ignorance, Elena could feel the fear associated with that name. "You will bring back a token," Chaska continued, his smile widening. "A shard of the black stone, which grows only in its most dangerous crevices. If you return empty-handed, we will know you are a liar and a thief, and we will cast you out. If you do not return at all." He shrugged, a gesture of supreme indifference. "Well, then we will know what you truly were." Elena's blood ran cold. Fear, sharp and coiling like a snake, twisted in her gut. The Black Cliff. She saw the name reflected in the horrified eyes of the women and children in the crowd. She glanced at Takakota. His face was a mask of thunderous fury. He had spoken of it once, in a hushed tone. A place of treacherous winds and sheer drops into darkness. A place where the spirits of the wind howled like lost souls. Chaska stepped back, his work done. He had turned the tribe's fear into a death sentence for her. His face was twisted in a triumphant grin. Elena's eyes met Takakota's across the firelight. He had saved her from the snow, from the raiders. But he couldn't save her from this. This was a fight she had to face alone. Her struggle to survive had just taken a sharp and very deadly turn. The wind didn't just blow at the Black Cliff, it screamed. It was a wounded, furious beast, howling as it clawed its way up the sheer rock face. Elena trudged through the deep snow, her breath coming in ragged, icy clouds that were instantly ripped away by the gale. Ahead, the cliff loomed, a spire of jagged black rock rising like a set of dark, rotten fangs against the oppressive gray sky. The air here was different, colder, thinner, and filled with a palpable sense of menace. It bit through her thin cloak, through her skin, and chilled her straight to the bone. Every step was a monumental effort. Her legs shook with fatigue and fear, her muscles burning with a cold fire. Behind her, the silent, snow-choked forest stretched for miles. The camp, with its fire and its hostile faces, was a world away. Elena's fingers, numb and trembling, clutched the small, sharp hunting knife Takakota had pressed into her hand just before she left. his touch a fleeting moment of warmth in the pre-dawn gloom. "Trust yourself," he had whispered, his dark eyes filled with a grim, solemn light. "You are stronger than you know." But as she stood at the base of the towering cliff, with the wind threatening to tear her from her feet, she felt anything but strong. She felt small, insignificant, mortal. The trial was simple. Climb high enough to find a shard of the unique jet-black stone that grew on these rocks, and bring it back. It was a test of courage, Chaska had said, but Elena knew it was a death sentence in disguise. She began to climb. The rock was slick with ice, offering precious few handholds. She moved slowly, testing every grip, every foothold, her fingers raw and bleeding. The wind pushed and pulled at her, a malevolent giant trying to peel her from the rock. Higher she went, the world shrinking below her. The trees became a dark green carpet dusted with white. The silence was absolute, broken only by her own ragged breathing and the eternal scream of the wind. Then she saw it. About 20 feet above her, nestled in a deep crevice on a narrow, treacherous-looking ledge, was a vein of the stone. It glittered faintly in the dim light, blacker than a starless night. It was her goal, her proof, her salvation. The ledge was barely wide enough for a single foot. To reach it, she would have to traverse a sheer face of rock with almost nothing to hold on to. Gritting her teeth, her jaw aching from the cold and tension, she began to move sideways. Her fingers, scraped and bloody, found tiny cracks in the rock. Her toes, numb inside her worn boots, searched for purchase. Sweat, cold and clammy, dripped down her face despite the freezing temperature. Her heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. Inch by agonizing inch, she moved closer. Her arm stretched out, her fingertips straining, grazing the smooth, cold surface of the black shard. Almost there, just a little further. Suddenly, the rock beneath her right hand crumbled. A small shower of pebbles and ice cascaded into the abyss below. Elena cried out as her body slipped, her feet scrabbling for a hold that wasn't there. For one terrifying, heart-stopping moment, she was dangling, her left hand clawing desperately at a tiny nub of rock, her legs swinging wildly over the dizzying drop. The wind roared in triumph, trying to rip her away. This was it. Chaska had gotten his wish, but as her body swung, her free hand shot out in a last, desperate lunge. Her fingers, by sheer blind luck, closed around the shard of black stone. She didn't just touch it. Her fingers wrapped around its sharp edges, the pain a distant, unimportant fact. She yanked. The stone broke free from the cliff face with a sharp crack. At the same instant, her other hand, the one holding her entire weight, found a more solid hold. With a guttural cry that was more animal than human, a roar of pure defiance against the wind and the cliff and death itself, she pulled herself up. She scrambled onto the narrow ledge, her body collapsing against the cold rock, chest heaving, hot tears of relief and terror stinging her eyes. She was alive. In her palm, the shard of black stone glistened. It was real. It was sharp and cold, its edges cutting into her skin. But it was real. It was proof. As Elena slowly, shakily rose to her feet, the wind still howling its fury behind her, she knew she had passed Chaska's test. She had faced the black cliff, and she had won. But as she clutched the stone, a new, cold dread washed over her. She had proven her courage. She had won her right to stay. But what awaited her back at the camp, now that she had defied Chaska's will to see her dead, could be far more dangerous than any cliff edge. She had not just earned her place. She had made a powerful enemy,